As you've heard from our conversation at this current time, we're expanding our work amongst the homeless by improving our facilities in the city of Sydney and also looking at new avenues to do this. Today is also a day when we remember the gift of the Holy Spirit as it came upon the earliest church. So I'm reading from Acts chapter 2, verses 1 through to 21. When the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Suddenly a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. Now there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. When they heard the sound, the crowd came together in bewilderment because each one heard in their own language being spoken. Utterly amazed, they asked, "Aren't all these who are speaking Galileans? Then how is it that each of us hears them in our native language?" Parthians, Medes, and Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and parts of Libya near Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts to Judaism, Cretians and Arabs. We hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own tongues. Amazed and perplexed, they asked one another, "What does this mean?" Some, however, made fun of them and said, "They've had too much wine." Then Peter stood up with the 11, raised his voice and addressed the crowd. "Fellow Jews and all of you who live in Jerusalem, let me explain this to you. Listen carefully to what I say. These people are not drunk as you suppose. It's only 9 in the morning. No, this is what they've spoken by the prophet Joel. In the last days, God says, I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your young men will see visions. Your old men will dream dreams. Even on my servants, both men and women, I will pour out my spirit in those days, and they will prophesy. I will show wonders in the heavens above and signs on the earth below, blood and fire and billows of smoke. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the great and glorious day of the Lord. And everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved." It's a marvellous climax, really, isn't it, to that day of Pentecost, the speech, the sermon, the sense of everybody from all over the world being caught up in this movement. The spread of the activity of God. It becomes a vibrant part. And when I read verses 5 to 11 in this chapter, I've got this marvellous picture of staying in Jerusalem, people from all different places, and you've got all these different parts of the world of people caught up. You know, I always think this is one of the most difficult readings to ever have to read in church for people who are not used to it, because, gosh, you've got all these places, Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents from various places, all somehow part of this Spirit of God. It impacts on the great crowd with the power of God and amazement. We're told that amazed and perplexed, they asked one another, "What does this mean?" You see, then Peter becomes the agent, and I like this bit. If you've never noticed it before, notice it now. Peter stood up with the 11. So he stood up and they all stood up with him. He became the recognized leader of the Christian church. He stood up and he offers what must be one of the finest sermons ever preached. It's a marvelous picture as he addresses the crowd. He becomes the agent, if you like, and it fulfills the long-awaited prophecy from the Old Testament. It was a marvelous moment. It was a great beginning. It was something that would always be looked back on by the church as being important. Some have called it the birthday of the church, and I think in some ways it is. I think local churches have anniversaries and birthdays, but there is one birthday for the whole church throughout the whole world, and that has to be at Pentecost. Now, we talked earlier about our Edward Eager Centre, and I hope some of you might feel led to help us in some way. But the Edward Eager Centre has a service every Sunday, and they too, it's their anniversary. There will be churches with thousands in the mega churches around the country and around the world. They'll be celebrating. But for all of us, it's absolutely central to who we are. It enables us to celebrate the gift of the Spirit. Now, Brother Lawrence, in his marvelous book, The Practice of the Presence of God, talked about the gale of the Holy Spirit taking us forward. Taking us forward, he writes, even in sleep. In other words, you can't stop it. It's a powerful movement that spread through the world. It all began on that first Pentecost.